Hey there, friends. Tonight, I'm going to take you far away from the comfort of your warm bed and into a world you wouldn't have survived for a single day. The horrifying life of a pirate. You've probably heard stories about pirates, the treasure maps, the daring escapes, the skull flags flapping in the wind. Maybe you've even dressed as one for Halloween or imagined sailing on a great wooden ship under the Caribbean sun, free as the ocean breeze. But the real story, it wasn't glorious. It wasn't golden. It was grotesque. Let's begin where all pirate stories begin, not with a buried chest, but with desperation. Most men who became pirates didn't do it for the thrill. They did it because they had no other choice. Life in 17th century Europe was cruel, especially if you were poor, and almost everyone was poor. If you were lucky enough to find work, it likely meant breaking your back in fields, shoveling coal, or dying young in a factory, if not starving long before that. So when a ship came to port offering adventure and profit, it didn't matter that the pay was low, the food was bad, and the chance of death was nearly certain. It was better than rotting in the streets. Now imagine the moment they stepped on board, wide-eyed, perhaps hopeful, maybe even excited. That would disappear within days. The smell hit you first. It wasn't just salt and fish. It was rotting wood, dried blood, vomit, the oily stink of unwashed men packed shoulder to shoulder, and something else you couldn't place until you saw the rats dragging pieces of decaying food across the deck. There was no escape from it. It was in your clothes, your hair, your tongue. The ship, often a stolen merchant vessel retrofitted for combat, wasn't glamorous. Creaked and groaned with every wave. The sails were patched with mismatched canvas, and the hull often leaked just enough to keep you nervous but not quite enough to sink. Below deck, it was pitch black, damp, and cramped. You couldn't stand upright. You slept on a hard plank or a pile of rope if you were lucky. And the food, if you could even call it that. You didn't eat fresh meat unless something died unexpectedly. A goat, a rat, or a fellow sailor. What you got instead was hardtack, a kind of dry, rock-solid biscuit made of flour and water. It wasn't just stale. It was often infested with tiny white maggots. The men called them weevils, and most just shook them off and ate anyway. Others didn't bother. Extra protein, they'd say, joking through rotted teeth. When not eating hardtack, you drank beer or watered-down rum. Fresh water turned green and slimy within days, and you couldn't risk it. Scurvy was always waiting. Scurvy, the old sailor's curse, was more terrifying than the enemy's cannon. It started with weakness, bleeding gums, bruises that came out of nowhere. Then teeth fell out. Wounds refused to heal. Eventually, your body began to rot from the inside. You could die in your hammock while everyone else slept, silent and forgotten. Now think about the work. You didn't rest. You didn't get days off. The sea doesn't care if your muscles ache or your hand is infected. You hauled ropes, climbed masts slick with rain, patched sails in storms, and cleaned the deck with your bare hands while waves slapped you across the face. If you were sick or injured, there was no doctor. Only the ship's cook might offer a dirty blade and a bottle of rum if something needed cutting. Discipline was brutal. The pirate code wasn't just a myth, it was law, and it was enforced without mercy. Steal from another man's share? You'd be marooned on a sandbar with nothing but a bottle of water and a pistol. Fall asleep on watch? You'd be whipped, or worse, thrown overboard. And that brings us to the nights. When darkness settled over the ocean, the ship creaked like a dying beast. The only light came from lanterns swinging above your head. Men snored, muttered, or groaned in fevered dreams. Others sharpened knives or told stories in hushed tones. Most about ghosts, curses, or ships that vanished without a trace. Sleep didn't come easily. The floor was hard, the air was thick, and rats often scurried over your legs. As for entertainment, there wasn't much. Some men carved dice from bones, sang low songs about lost loves, or scratched rude poems into the wood. But mostly they waited for the next ship to chase, or be chased. You see, pirate life wasn't constant battle. In fact, weeks could pass without seeing another vessel. And boredom, it was a different kind of danger. Men turned on each other. Fights broke out over nothing. A bad card game or a spilled drink could end in blood. And when a ship finally appeared on the horizon, hope wasn't the first thing you felt. It was fear, because combat at sea was madness. Ships didn't fight from a distance like in the movies. They rammed. They crashed. Men leapt onto enemy decks with knives in their teeth and pistols in their hands. The air filled with black powder smoke and screams. You didn't wear armor. You wore torn linen and prayed the other guy missed. You could be stabbed, crushed by falling wood, or set on fire. And if you survived, and if the enemy surrendered, well, it wasn't always over. Because sometimes they begged for mercy. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they were just boys, younger than you, holding on to each other as the sea turned red. But pirates didn't take prisoners. At least not always. Sometimes they let a few live to row back and tell the tale. And if you happen to be the one taken prisoner by another crew, well, let's just say your death wouldn't be quick. You're probably wondering why anyone would choose this, why they stayed, why they didn't jump overboard or try to escape. It's because they had nothing else. And for a few, very few, there was gold. There were tales of buried treasure, of Spanish galleons heavy with silver, of fortunes stolen in a single bloody hour. Most never saw it. Most died with empty pockets and broken bones. But the myth lived on, and maybe that was enough. We'll talk more about what happened when pirates came to land, if they ever did, and what kind of horror waited for them there. But for now, rest your eyes and try to imagine the sound of the waves crashing against that filthy wooden hull, the creak of sails overhead, and the whisper of a dying man in the bunk beside you, dreaming of gold he'd never touch, when pirates finally touched land after weeks, or even months. At sea, they didn't stroll down gangplanks to the cheers of crowds and the jingling of gold in their pockets. They stumbled, unshaven and sunburnt, onto unfamiliar soil with legs that barely remembered how to walk, stomachs knotted from rotten food, and eyes narrowed from squinting at the endless sunlit sea. Some of them wept, not from joy, but because the sudden stillness of the ground beneath their feet felt more terrifying than any storm they had faced. The earth didn't move. That silence, that eerie lack of motion, could break a man before a sword ever reached his throat. The towns they reached weren't cities of riches and indulgence. Most ports that tolerated pirates, if they weren't already built on piracy, were half-lawless, plague-ridden nests of corruption. The buildings leaned like drunks. The air reeked of sewage and old fish. Dogs fought over bones in alleys where the dead sometimes lay for days before anyone noticed. If the ship had earned a prize, plunder from a merchant vessel or a captured hold of silver and sugar, the men were paid, but not in wages. Pirates didn't earn a salary. They shared loot divided by code. The captain got a double share, the quartermaster got 1.5, and the rest was portioned out according to role, injuries, or favoritism. If there was no loot, there was no pay. If the treasure was small, you might end a 6-week voyage with less than a coin to your name. But even with coin in hand, their time on land was no relief. In taverns lit by candle stubs and thick with smoke, they spent whatever they had on cheap rum, watered wine, and meat so greasy it left a film on their fingers for hours. The brothels offered companionship, but not care. Disease flowed like spilled ale. Venereal sicknesses, fevers, and something worse called the Black Flux, a gut-wrenching horror that left men bent double, bleeding from places too awful to name. Doctors, if you found them, offered little help. They bled patients with knives, fed them mercury, or drilled into skulls to release evil vapors. Survival was chance, not medicine. Most didn't seek help at all. They drank until they couldn't feel pain, then drank more until they couldn't feel anything at all. And fights, there were always fights. Pirates, after all, weren't trained gentlemen. They didn't solve problems with duels or quiet conversation. Arguments ended with shattered bottles, lost teeth, and sometimes corpses. If you insulted the wrong man, or flirted with the wrong girl, or simply looked like you had too much money in your boots, you could find yourself stabbed before sunrise and buried behind the tavern with no name to mark the grave. Some pirates never returned to the ship. They vanished into the muck of the port, robbed, jailed, or dead. Others tried to run, believing they could build new lives, far from the ocean and its horrors. They were almost always caught. The pirate code didn't forgive desertion. The punishment? A slow death, tied to the mast and whipped until your back was a ribbon of flesh, or left for days without food, staring at the sails you once called home. But many went back willingly, not because they missed the ship, but because the land was no safer. On board, they knew the rules, the dangers, the rhythm of life. On land, everything was unknown. Every handshake might be a trap. Every alley might hide a blade. Every whispered deal might end with a noose around your neck. And speaking of nooses, let's talk about the law. Pirates were hunted like animals. The British, the Spanish, the Dutch, every crown wanted their heads. Some sent privateers, others sent entire naval fleets. The reward for a captured pirate could buy a small house. So you weren't just running from the sea's fury, you were fleeing every patrol, every governor, every man with a badge and a grudge. If you were caught, your trial wasn't fair. In fact, it wasn't really a trial at all. You stood in shackles, filthy and exhausted, while a powdered judge read a sentence already decided. No lawyers, no appeals, only a cart ride to the gallows. And hanging, that was mercy. Some pirates were gibbeted, locked in iron cages and hung on posts at the edge of town. There, they died slowly, bones breaking under their own weight, flesh picked by crows, swinging in the wind as a warning to others. Days later, when the bones finally stopped rattling, the cage stayed, rusting, empty, but never forgotten. But not all pirates feared the rope. Some wore death like a badge. They tattooed skulls on their arms, sharpened their teeth with knives, wore human bones as necklaces. They believed the world had already taken everything from them, so they would take everything back or die trying. And still, the sea always called them home. Even those who had escaped the worst punishments, who had tasted soft beds or honest work, found themselves wandering back to the docks. Something in the salt air, in the slap of the waves, pulled them like a ghost's whisper. Maybe it was freedom, or maybe it was the only life they'd ever known. Because even as terrible as it was, this brutal, foul, merciless life, somehow the land always felt worse. They believed that if they kept sailing, if they found the right map, if they fought hard enough, they'd one day strike it rich. That one last voyage would change everything. But it never did. Not for most. Not for nearly any of them. Next, I'll take you deeper into the heart of a pirate crew. The strange rules they lived by, the punishments they feared most, and the dark rituals that kept them alive in a world built to kill them. Just let the sound of the wind in the sails carry you there. Slowly, quietly. Every pirate ship had its own rules, and though they were lawless in the eyes of the world, on board they followed a structure that was brutally precise. It wasn't just chaos and anarchy. It was a tightrope walk of order, violence, and survival. The pirate code wasn't fiction. It wasn't romantic. It was a set of expectations written not with ink and parchment, but with blood, broken bones, and the silent acceptance that stepping out of line could mean losing a hand, an ear, or your life. These codes were often nailed to the mainmast, written in jagged letters, stained from years of salt and weather. Everyone aboard had to swear on it. If you refused, you weren't welcomed with pity. You were thrown overboard or left behind at the next desolate island. And the rules, oh, they were strict. No fighting aboard the ship. If you had a problem with another man, you settled it on shore in the sand with pistols or blades. If one of you died, so be it. If both of you died, the crew sighed and moved on. But if you brought that violence aboard, if blood touched the deck, you'd feel the wrath of the quartermaster, and it wouldn't be quick. Lights out at sunset, silence on watch, no gambling with another man's gear, no stealing from the common loot, and never, under any circumstances, desert your post during battle. Do so, and your punishment would make death seem like a gift. The quartermaster was the enforcer, not a leader like the captain, but something darker. He didn't shout. He watched. He remembered. And when someone broke the code, he brought the crew together, not for justice, but for ritual. Punishments were public. They had to be. That was the point. For minor offenses, you might get a lashing. Your shirt ripped away, your arms bound. the whip slicing across your back until your skin peeled in ribbons and your screams turned hoarse. The whip wasn't clean. It was caked with salt, old blood, and sometimes fragments of metal woven in for effect. Infection wasn't just possible, it was expected. For stealing, they had a special punishment: marooning. You were taken to a sandbar, far from any shipping lanes, with only a bottle of rum, a loaded pistol, and a few scraps of food. You were left there to die slowly, baked by the sun, eaten by insects, or swallowed by madness. Some shot themselves within hours. Others lasted days, their minds unraveling as they watched the horizon for a ship that would never come. There were darker stories. Some pirates didn't maroon their traitors, they made examples. Tied to the mast in the midday sun, smeared with honey, left to the mercy of insects. Others were dragged behind the ship, ropes tied to their ankles, barnacles tearing flesh from bone as they were pulled through the surf. And then there was keel hauling. The worst of all, it wasn't used often, but when it was, it left every man on board shaken. The condemned was tied with rope, thrown over one side of the ship, and dragged beneath the hull. The bottom of a wooden vessel wasn't smooth. It was a reef of razor-sharp barnacles, algae, rusted nails, and rot. If the first pass didn't kill you, the second would. If you somehow lived, you didn't really. You were never the same. But the code wasn't just punishment. It was survival. Because without order, without structure, a pirate ship became a floating coffin. The men needed routine, needed hierarchy, needed someone to blame when things went wrong. And for all the cruelty, there were strange moments of fairness. Spoils were shared. Every man, regardless of his past, his scars, or his sins, received his portion. If you lost an eye or a leg in battle, the code promised compensation. More gold, more rum, more respect. Not because pirates were kind, but because next time it could be you. They even voted for their captain. Democracy at sea of a sort. A captain ruled during battle. He made the decisions, shouted the orders, pointed the cannons, but outside of combat, he was just another voice. If the crew lost faith, they could remove him. Not with bloodshed, not with mutiny, but with a simple vote. It was cold, impersonal, and absolute. This strange structure, this twisted sense of equality, was what held the ship together through storms, starvation, and slaughter. But it also created something worse: paranoia. If you were too successful, if you got too rich, if you earned too much respect, others watched you. They whispered, they plotted, because on a pirate ship, envy was everywhere. Men disappeared. Some fell overboard in the night. Others went on deck for a breath of air and never came back. No one asked questions. Asking made you suspicious. So you smiled. You shared your rum. You kept your eyes open and your back against the wall. The pirate's life wasn't just about fighting the sea. It was about surviving your brothers. And still they sang. At night, above the creaking of the hull and the lapping of the water, you could sometimes hear it, low voices, hoarse and weary, rising into the dark sky. Songs of home, of gold, of death. Songs that had no beginning and no end. Because while the code kept them alive, it also reminded them every single day that they weren't truly free. They had left behind kings and taxes and chains, only to shackle themselves to a floating prison of their own design. And in that prison, even joy came with a cost. Soon, I'll take you into the heart of battle, to the thunder of cannons, the crash of swords, and the smell of gunpowder. But not yet. For now, listen to the sea. It's never truly silent. Not when ghosts still roam its surface, searching for the ships that stole their lives. There was no calm approach, no dramatic music swelling in the background as the pirate ship closed in on its prey. There was only screaming, the creak of wood as the ship turned too sharply, the slamming of waves against the hull, the wind tearing at the sails like it wanted to rip them apart. And the men, those broken, scarred, starving men, gritting their teeth and loading cannons with hands that barely stopped shaking. A battle at sea began with silence. Not peace, not calm, just the moment before chaos. That moment when you saw the other ship, full of terrified merchants or angry marines, bracing for death or glory. You smelled the black powder. You heard the captain shout orders through foam and wind. And then, everything vanished in a thunderclap. The first cannonball didn't just shatter wood, it shattered your world. The deck jolted beneath your feet. Splinters the size of daggers shot through the air like arrows. You could be standing 1 second and eyeless the next, torn apart by flying debris before you even saw the enemy. Smoke swallowed everything. Thick, choking, black, made of salt and fire. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. You couldn't breathe without coughing up what felt like your lungs. The smoke made men deaf, blind, panicked. And still they fought. The cannon crews moved like dancers in hell. One man shoved the powder, another rammed the shot, a third lit the fuse. They moved quickly, precisely, like their lives depended on rhythm alone, because they did. A single misstep meant the cannon misfired. And when a cannon misfired, it didn't ask permission. It exploded. You didn't just fear the enemy's fire. You feared your own. And when the ships grew close enough to board, when the grappling hooks found purchase and the hulls scraped together like giants grinding their teeth, that's when the real nightmare began. Pirates didn't fight clean. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't line up like noble soldiers. They wore whatever hadn't rotted. Some had iron spikes strapped to their boots. Others had knives hidden under their tongues. Many were shirtless, covered in tattoos and scars. Blood already splashed across their skin before the first blade was drawn. They didn't carry polished swords. They carried cutlasses, chipped and blackened by years of salt. Axes stolen from dockyards. Rusted pistols that might fire or might not. Clubs wrapped in rope and nails. The goal wasn't to win, it was to terrify. When pirates boarded, they howled like animals. They smeared ash across their faces. They lit their beards on fire. They screamed nonsense just to shake the enemy. And sometimes that worked better than any weapon. Because most merchant crews weren't fighters. They were cooks, clerks, young boys trying to earn a few coins. When the pirates came, they dropped weapons and begged. They cried. They locked themselves below deck, praying that the pirates wouldn't find the hatch. But pirates always found the hatch. What happened next wasn't always told in songs. Sometimes, if the crew surrendered quickly, they were spared. They were bound and dropped on an island, left with a boat and a warning. But if they resisted, if even one man fired a shot, mercy became a memory. The fighting was fast, clumsy, and brutal. No fancy fencing, no clever footwork, just hacking, stabbing, grabbing at throats, biting off ears. Men slipped on blood. Others drowned in the shallow pools that formed in the dips of the deck. Bodies rolled as the ship rocked. And through it all, the screams, the smoke, the thunder, you felt nothing but survival. No thoughts, no dreams, just movement, just noise. Victory didn't feel like glory, felt like silence. When the enemy stopped moving and the last musket was fired, and the sea settled around you again, you looked around and saw what you had done. The bodies, the broken timbers, the sails torn apart like paper, the men slumped in corners, clutching wounds they'd never recover from. And then, the plundering. Whatever was left was dragged up. Barrels of salted meat, crates of spices, bags of sugar or tobacco, anything that could be sold. Gold was rare, silver rarer still. You mostly stole life, supplies to keep your heart beating until the next fight. Sometimes they found prisoners in the hold. Slaves, bound and half dead, or kidnapped merchants who hadn't seen the sun in weeks. Pirates didn't always free them. Sometimes they sold them back. Sometimes they didn't ask questions. Sometimes they simply walked away. Once the ship was stripped, it was either burned or left adrift, a floating coffin on a dead sea. Some captains ordered a single cannonball fired through the hull, sending the ship down slowly as the waves swallowed the evidence. Others left messages, flags tied to the mast, skulls nailed to the door of the captain's quarters, a warning written in blood. And then it was over. Until the next time. There was no rest after battle. You cleaned the deck. You patched the sails. You dragged the dead overboard, whispered whatever words you knew, and watched them vanish into the depths. And sometimes you dreamed about them later, the ones you'd fought, the ones who hadn't fought back, the ones who screamed your name as you raised your blade. But you didn't speak of it. Pirates didn't speak of ghosts, because deep down they knew the ocean never forgot. Soon, I'll tell you about the storms, the ones that swallowed whole fleets, broke men's minds, and proved, once and for all, that the sea was the true captain of every ship that dared to sail her. But for now, feel the roll of the waves, the sting of salt on your skin, and the silence that follows after the last body hits the water. The greatest enemy a pirate ever faced wasn't a Navy ship, or a mutiny, or even the gallows. It was the storm. Not all storms came with warning. Some rolled in like black curtains drawn suddenly across the sky, silencing birds, stilling the air, and making even the most hardened men glance nervously at the horizon. Others came slowly, building for hours, their clouds boiling with lightning, their thunder distant but never quiet. And when they struck, the world changed. Imagine being in the middle of the ocean, far from any coast, far from anything resembling shelter or safety. The ship groans like a beast in agony. The sky turns to ink, and the sea no longer feels like water. It's alive, and it's angry. Rain doesn't fall. It assaults. The wind shrieks through the rigging like a banshee, and the sails snap so hard you think they'll tear free from the masts. Every rope becomes a whip. Every step becomes a fight against invisible hands trying to throw you into the black abyss. The deck turns to chaos. Men run barefoot, slipping in puddles, shouting to each other through the roar of wind and crashing waves. Orders are screamed, misunderstood, lost in the storm. The captain holds the wheel with hands like stone, teeth clenched, soaked to the bone, eyes locked on nothing but survival. And you cling to whatever you can, your fingers bleeding from splinters, your ears ringing from the howling void. Lightning explodes across the sky like gods throwing spears, and in the sudden flashes, you see the faces of your crewmates twisted with terror. Some ships simply vanish. No fight, no flare, no farewell. 1 minute they're there, and the next they're gone, swallowed by a wave taller than a house, broken like toys torn apart plank by plank. Their lights blink out, their sails shredded, their hulls cracked open like bones. If you're lucky enough to survive, you don't speak of it. You don't say the names of the men who were swept overboard. You don't mention the screams that echoed above the wind, or the hands that slipped from yours just before they were gone. You just patch the sails, dry what you can, and pretend you didn't see the ocean eat your brothers alive. And some men, they break. Storms don't just destroy ships, they destroy minds. After the wind dies, after the waves calm, after the sun returns and shines on the wreckage and the soaked faces of those still breathing, there's always one man who doesn't come back whole. He stares at nothing. He whispers to himself. He jumps at shadows, forgets how to eat, stops speaking altogether. The crew calls it ocean mad. No one knows what causes it. Maybe it's the sheer helplessness of being tossed around like driftwood. Maybe it's the guilt of surviving when others didn't. Maybe it's the sound, the relentless, heartless sound of water smashing against wood and screaming through the air. And when it happens, the crew doesn't wait. There's no cure, no comfort. They tie the madman's hands, give him a bottle of rum, and lower him gently into the sea, murmuring a prayer to whatever gods they still pretend to believe in. Because madness spreads. It takes only one voice shouting nonsense in the night to break the fragile grip of order on a ship already dangling above chaos. But storms weren't the only hunger the sea had. There was always hunger. Even on calm days under bright skies, when the sails were full and the wind was kind, men were hungry. Not just for food, but for something they couldn't name. They were thin, sunburnt, their bellies knotted with spoiled meat and sour water. Their bones ached from salt, their mouths dry even after drinking, their teeth loose from scurvy. Their dreams were filled with feasts they'd never taste again. Roasted meat, buttered bread, fresh fruit dripping with juice. But they woke to worms in biscuits. The worst part wasn't the hunger, it was what hunger did. It made you look at your crewmates differently. You started noticing how thin they were, how hollow their cheeks had become. You counted rations not in barrels, but in days. You learned the sound of an empty stomach at night, and you feared it. And in the darkest moments, when storms had taken the livestock, when the stores were spoiled, when even the rats had vanished, men whispered about choices. Choices no one wanted to name. There are records, unofficial, buried in letters, spoken of in cautious tones, of ships that resorted to the unthinkable. When the weakest man died, or when someone vanished in the dark, no questions were asked. Bones were found later, stripped clean. A stew pot left boiling long after midnight. Cannibalism was a line few crossed, but many knew existed. They'd never admit it, not aloud, not even to themselves. But on certain ships, under certain stars, after too many days without food, something changed. You looked at your brother differently. And that was the true horror. Not the waves, not the storms, not the cannonballs, but the slow, creeping realization that the sea didn't need to kill you, could make you kill yourself. It could strip away everything you were, your morals, your memories, your name, until all that remained was instinct, hunger, and fear. Soon, I'll tell you about the final days of the Pirate Age, what happened when the world caught up to them, when the flags were torn down, and the oceans became smaller, safer, sadder. But for now, try to rest, because if you were really there, right now, tossed beneath a storm, clutching a rope with bleeding fingers, bones frozen with fear, you wouldn't be able to close your eyes at all. The tropical sun did not just burn the skin, it cooked it. You could feel it sizzling on your back as if an invisible fire had been lit on your shoulders. There was no such thing as shade on the open deck, not when every inch of canvas above had to be filled with wind to keep the ship moving. Pirates didn't get parasols. They didn't get comfort. What they got was sweat, salt, and sores. By the third week at sea, rations had turned to nightmares. The bread, which at first seemed hard but edible, became almost alive with tiny, squirming maggots. Still, it was considered food. You learned to tap the biscuit on the wooden railing, knock the bugs out, and eat what remained, if only to silence the hunger gnawing at your belly like a rat trapped in a box. The salted meat fared no better. It was tough, often grayish, sometimes green on the edges, and sometimes so soaked in brine that chewing it would cut your gums open. But you ate it anyway. Everyone did. And drinking water? That luxury ran out in days. After that, barrels of ale and rum were used only because they wouldn't rot. The pirates didn't drink to celebrate. They drank to survive. But there's a problem when alcohol is the only thing between you and thirst. It turns men into monsters. One moment, someone would be singing a shanty, banging on the hull with a spoon. The next, he might stab his bunkmate over a spilled cup of grog. Below deck, the stench could drive a man mad. Sweat, blood, rot, vomit, and the musky stink of too many unwashed bodies crammed together in a space with no air. The hammocks, if you were lucky enough to have one, were damp and sticky from the humidity. And the rats, there were always rats, bold and fat, feeding on crumbs and sometimes on the toes of the men too sick or drunk to move. But even worse than the physical suffering was the endless, creeping boredom. Pirates' life wasn't a constant battle. Weeks could pass without a single ship on the horizon. The men would carve dice from bone, play cards stained with grease, or fight just to feel something. Anything. These weren't joyful games. These were desperate efforts to keep the mind from breaking. They'd bet everything. Shirts, boots, even future shares of loot they hadn't yet seen. And when someone lost too much, the knives came out. Some said death by blade was better than death by madness. And still, even with all this filth, disease, violence, despair, they stayed. Not because they loved it, but because there was nowhere else to go. A pirate who tried to leave often found his back torn open by lashes or a rope around his neck. The sea wasn't a place you visited. It was a prison without walls, and escape wasn't an option for most. And when storms hit, they hit without warning. The sky would turn black in minutes, and the waves would rise like mountains. You didn't steer a pirate ship in a storm, you prayed. Men were tossed overboard like toys, and the ones who stayed on the deck had to lash themselves to the mast or get swept away. Thunder roared louder than any cannon, and lightning would strike so close it blinded you. After the storm, you'd often find 2, 3, maybe 5 crew members missing, and you never found the bodies. But what about treasure? Gold? Jewels? The promises whispered in taverns before the journey began? That was the great lie. Most pirate ships never found any. The few that did, those victories were brief, sometimes catastrophic. Because when treasure entered the picture, so did betrayal. Some men would kill just to keep an extra coin. Entire crews were slaughtered in their sleep when greed boiled over. Trust was fragile. Friendships, if you could call them that, were measured in how long it took before someone tried to poison your stew or slip a knife between your ribs. And still, they pressed on. Because somewhere on the horizon, always, was the idea of one more ship, fat with cargo, slow on the water, filled with frightened sailors who would surrender without a fight. That dream, that illusion, kept the pirates moving. It gave them something to chase. But like water on the horizon, it was often just a mirage. Let me take you deeper into that life, where every new sunrise brought not hope, but 1,000 new ways to die. But even if you managed to survive the shipboard diseases, the storms, the violence, and the backbreaking labor, there was still the sea itself, endlessly hungry, always watching. You see, for a pirate, the ocean was not just a path to riches. It was a cruel and fickle master that demanded payment in sweat, blood, and sometimes sanity. The days were scorching and endless, the sun above blinding with no shade to hide under. The salt air cracked your lips, burned your throat, and mixed with the constant stink of tar, gunpowder, and rot. Pirates rarely bathed. Water was too precious. If you wanted to rinse off the sweat and filth, you'd have to jump into the sea, and risk being pulled under by sharks or worse, left behind if the ship didn't wait. The food was something out of a nightmare. By now, you know they ate hardtack, the infamous biscuits harder than wood. But there's more to this horror. Pirates often kept barrels of salted meat, and by meat, I mean indistinguishable cuts of animal flesh so packed with salt they could make your mouth bleed. Imagine chewing something that felt more like gnawing on a block of salt mixed with rubber. And then there were the barrels of peas or beans, but once the weevils found them, and they always did, it became a game of deciding whether to eat around the bugs or just pretend they were part of the flavor. Some pirates actually welcomed the extra protein. Others didn't care anymore. Fresh fruit? Only if they'd raided a ship recently. And fresh water? That was always a gamble. Water barrels often went bad, turning slimy and foul. They tried to mask the rot by mixing it with alcohol. That's right, rum wasn't just for fun. It was survival. Rum killed the taste of bad water and numbed the pain of everything else. So you drank, not to celebrate, but to forget the aching in your joints, the ulcers on your gums, and the cold knowledge that you might not live to see land again. And the smell, no one talks about the smell. A pirate ship wasn't just crowded. It was suffocating. Dozens of men crammed into tight quarters, sweating, bleeding, dying. The latrine was nothing more than a wooden board with a hole at the back of the ship, and it didn't always get used. Buckets were shared, not cleaned. The stench of human waste mingled with rotting food, moldy wood, festering wounds, and sea air. And if someone died and they couldn't bury him fast enough, that smell too joined the orchestra. Then came the worst part, the waiting. Long stretches of time with nothing to do. No ships in sight, no wind in the sails, just hours turning to days, turning to weeks of idle dread. Men grew bored, and boredom aboard a pirate ship was a dangerous thing. It meant gambling, fights, mutinies, fingers bitten off in knife games, or eyes gouged out over cheating accusations. There was no law but fear, and no justice but violence. To entertain themselves, pirates turned to cruelty. Some had pet monkeys or parrots, not for company, but for mockery or torment. Others passed time by burning rats alive or forcing newcomers to prove their bravery through twisted initiation rites. And if someone fell asleep on watch, it wasn't unusual for the punishment to be public whipping, branding, or even marooning. Left alone on an island with nothing but a bottle of water and a pistol. Most didn't last more than a few days. Some went mad before they died. Still, the pirate's life was not entirely without joy. Music was a rare light in the darkness. Sea shanties rose from their cracked voices, sometimes drunken and off-key, sometimes eerily beautiful. They carved flutes from bone or banged rhythms on barrels. Laughter, crude and loud, would echo across the waves when a story was told. Often filthy, always exaggerated. But even that joy was fragile. The next storm, the next fight, the next unlucky shot from a Navy cannon could tear it all away. And yet, they chose this. Most had no other path. Escaped slaves, failed farmers, runaway convicts, orphaned boys, betrayed sailors. This was the only life where they weren't owned by someone else. The freedom they chased came at a terrible price, and few ever lived long enough to enjoy it. But the worst was yet to come, because eventually the hunt always caught up with them. The British Navy, the Spanish Armada, the bounty hunters, all closing in. And when they were caught, their fate wasn't just death. It was a death meant to make an example. Next, we'll talk about what happened when a pirate was finally captured. It wasn't quick, and it certainly wasn't clean. The moment the Navy or bounty hunters caught a pirate, the ordeal truly began. Capture was not the end. It was a prelude to a slow, grinding demise that crushed hope beneath boots and chains. Pirates were thrown into filthy prisons where sunlight was a memory and rats outnumbered men. Cells were dark and damp, the air thick with despair and the stench of sickness. Some men lasted only days before disease, typhus, dysentery, or scurvy claimed them, their bodies discarded like garbage. Trial was a cruel performance. No jury of peers, no fair hearing, only the cold reading of accusations written in blood and fear. Judges, many drunk or bribed, recited sentences already decided by the Crown's hunger for order. Defendants were shackled, often unable to speak clearly, their clothes torn and their spirits broken. The gavel fell with terrifying finality. Guilty. The sentence, death. Public executions were as much for the crowd as for the pirate. The gallows towered over towns, a grim monument to the fate awaiting any who dared challenge the empire. On the scaffold, pirates faced their end with varying courage. Some screamed curses and spit at the crowd, others whispered prayers, and many went silent, eyes wide with terror. The noose tightened, the trapdoor fell, and a life ended with a snap or a slow choke, a final gasp lost in the murmurs of onlookers. But death did not always come swiftly. Some pirates were sentenced to be gibbeted, locked in iron cages and left to the elements. There, they hung for weeks or months, their bodies slowly consumed by rot and scavengers, a horrific warning to anyone tempted by the pirate's life. Children pointed, adults shuddered, and the cages remained long after the flesh had disappeared, rusting and empty. Others faced the sea one last time, sent off in small boats or cast adrift with nothing but hope and a prayer. Most drowned or starved before rescue came. Some were chained to the mast and keel-hauled, a punishment so brutal that few survived. Dragged beneath the ship's hull, scraped raw by barnacles and sharp wood, gasping for breath only to be pulled under again. It was a death reserved for the worst offenders. Yet even in death, pirates left a legacy. Stories of their greed, cruelty, and occasional kindness spread like wildfire in taverns and ports. They became legends, not heroes but warnings. Men who defied kings, tore through the seas with bloodied blades, and lived lives so terrible that survival was the greatest victory. But why? Why choose such a life? Because freedom on the sea was raw and fierce. It was a desperate grasp at control in a world that crushed the weak. Pirates were not saints, but in their cruelty and madness, they found a kind of liberty. One paid for in pain, betrayal, and death. And somewhere, beneath the endless waves and whispering winds, their ghosts still sail. Reminders that the ocean keeps its secrets, and that no man who chooses piracy ever truly escapes the price. Next, I will take you beneath the deck, to the secrets kept in shadows, the whispered fears, and the hidden horrors pirates never spoke of aloud. Beneath the creaking deck, away from the harsh sunlight and the endless spray of salt water, lay a world few outsiders ever glimpsed. This was where the true horrors of piracy lived, not just in battles or storms, but in the shadows cast by flickering lanterns and whispered in corners where no law reached. Below deck, the air was thick with mildew and decay. The The wooden planks were slick with spilled rum, blood, and seawater, the smells mingling into a pungent fog that clung to clothes and skin. Rats scurried without fear, their eyes gleaming in the dark as they feasted on scraps and the occasional forgotten finger or toe. Here, the wounded lay in cramped hammocks or on bare boards, moaning softly or cursed in pain as crude surgeons, if you could call them that, worked without anesthesia, using knives and saws that had seen better days. Infections spread quickly, turning minor wounds into death sentences. Amputations were common, not for mercy, but to stop rot from spreading. Men who lost limbs were promised compensation, but many slipped into despair and madness instead. Sleep was a luxury. The cries of the sick, the groans of the dying, the endless creaking of the ship kept men awake for nights on end. Some tried to drown their fears in alcohol, but even the strongest rum couldn't quiet the pounding in their heads or the visions that came with fever. And then there were the secrets, whispers that passed between men like cursed gold. Tales of ghosts stalking the decks at midnight, of cursed treasure that brought madness, of crew members disappearing without a trace. Superstition ruled below deck more than any code. No sailor wanted to be the last one alive when the spirits came calling. Some pirates believed that the sea claimed more than lives, claimed souls, that those lost to the depths wandered forever beneath the waves, unable to find peace. Others thought the ocean was alive, a monstrous entity that watched, waited, and punished. The sea wasn't just a place, it was a predator. Trust was scarce. Even among brothers in arms, suspicion gnawed at every glance. Men watched each other for signs of betrayal, theft, or weakness. Paranoia grew like mold in the damp, shadowed corners. Friends became enemies overnight. Whispers of mutiny sparked fires in hearts already burned by desperation. And yet, there were moments of fragile humanity. Quiet conversations held in hushed tones, shared cigarettes passed hand to hand, small acts of kindness that kept the last threads of sanity intact. But such moments were fleeting. The pirates' world was a cycle of violence, fear, and fleeting hope. Above deck, the sun might shine, and the ship might sail smoothly, but below, the darkness was never far away. Soon, I will tell you about the rare moments of joy and music, and the haunting songs pirates sang to keep their spirits alive amidst the endless cruelty. For now, let the ocean's whispers fill your mind as you drift deeper into this endless night. Amid the relentless misery, pirates found fleeting escapes in music and stories, the rare sparks that lit the darkness on endless nights at sea. When the sky turned a bruised purple and the sun slipped beneath the waves, the crew would gather in whatever patch of calm they could find, voices rough from salt and rum joining in shanties that echoed across the rolling ocean. These songs weren't just entertainment. They were survival. Each chorus carried tales of lost loves, sunken ships, bloody battles, and the elusive hope of freedom. They told stories of faraway lands, glittering gold, and revenge so sweet it burned like fire on the tongue. Even as the ship rocked beneath them and the wind howled like a beast, the music wove a fragile thread connecting men to the world beyond their floating prison. But the songs were never purely joyful. They carried sorrow deep within their notes, a constant reminder of the blood spilled and the brothers lost. Sometimes, a lone voice would falter, breaking into a sob that rippled through the group, reminding everyone that beneath the bravado and laughter was a well of despair waiting to drown them all. Between songs, stories were traded, exaggerated, terrifying, sometimes unbelievable tales of monstrous sea creatures dragging ships under, of cursed treasure that doomed all who touched it, of ghosts that whispered warnings in the dead of night. These stories fed the fear that lived in every pirate's heart. Yet they also forged a bond, a shared understanding that in this lawless world, they were the only family any of them had. The rare moments of joy were fragile, easily shattered by the harsh reality of life aboard. A sudden storm, a bitter fight, or the death of a crewmate could silence the laughter and music in an instant, plunging the ship back into its grim routine. Yet the songs always returned, rising again like smoke from the ashes, a stubborn refusal to surrender to the darkness. This is the paradox of the pirate's life. Bound by brutality and fear, yet clinging desperately to moments of beauty and humanity. Soon, I will share with you the darker side of those songs, the curses hidden in their verses, the warnings passed down through generations, and the secrets pirates dared not speak aloud. For now, let the haunting melodies drift through your mind as the ship sails on through endless night. Those songs, soaked in salt and sorrow, often held secrets, coded warnings and curses wrapped in melody, passed down to keep crews alive and warn of dangers no map could show. Pirates believed music could curse as much as bless. A wrong note sung at the wrong time might bring storms or death. The verses whispered of ghost ships that appeared on moonless nights, carrying doomed souls who never found rest. These stories weren't just tales. They were survival guides cloaked in myth, lessons passed in shadows where the law never reached. Beneath the laughter, beneath the bravado, lurked fears too real to name. Men spoke of the Davy Jones locker, a watery grave waiting for those foolish enough to tempt fate. They warned of sea witches and curses laid upon stolen treasures that doomed even the richest pirate to madness. Every coin buried beneath an island's soil came with a price. Every loot gained in blood tethered to a curse whispered through generations. This constant dance with superstition kept pirates alert, their eyes flicking to the horizon, their hands never far from weapons. Trust was fragile. Alliances shifted like the tides. The same men who sang and joked by day might plot betrayal by night. Paranoia was a survival skill, sharper than any blade. Yet amid this web of fear and violence, brief moments of loyalty blossomed. Bonds forged in fire and blood held tight enough to save lives and see ships through the darkest nights. A trusted friend's warning could mean the difference between life and a watery grave. These friendships, rare and precious, were treasured more fiercely than gold. But such loyalty was always shadowed by the knowledge that any man could turn on you if the wind shifted. The pirate's world was a tempest of danger not only from enemies but from within. Mutiny was always a breath away, and suspicion was the sharpest weapon of all. Soon, I will reveal the chilling truth about pirate mutinies, the betrayals that tore crews apart, the blood spilled not on foreign shores but beneath their own flag, and the desperate fights for power that turned brothers into enemies. Until then, listen closely to the creak of the ship, the whisper of the wind. It carries the secrets of those who dared live and die upon the endless sea. Mutiny was the shadow that haunted every pirate crew, a silent threat lurking beneath the roar of the sea and the clatter of cutlasses. It was not just a battle for command. It was a raw struggle for survival where trust shattered like glass underfoot. Every captain knew that his life depended not only on his skill with sword and cannon, but on the fragile loyalty of men who saw him as both leader and rival. A whisper in the dark, a glance too long, a grudge left to fester. These were the seeds from which mutiny grew. It was born from hunger, fear, greed, and broken promises. When the ship's rations dwindled or the gold ran dry, suspicion turned brother against brother, and the once unified crew fractured into factions, ready to kill for scraps of power. Mutiny didn't wait for an opportunity, it created one. The quartermaster, a man as ruthless as he was cunning, might conspire with a few trusted allies to overthrow the captain. Or perhaps a younger, hungrier pirate would rally the men, promising riches and freedom if the old order was torn down. When the moment came, it was chaos, a whirlwind of steel, curses, and shattered alliances. The decks became battlegrounds where no quarter was given. Friends fought friends, blood spilled not in battle against enemies, but in treachery beneath their own flag. The screams of the dying mingled with the clash of blades and the thunder of fists. Men who had sailed together for years turned their knives on each other, eyes wild with desperation. When a mutiny succeeded, the new leader often ruled with fear, knowing his position was as unstable as the rolling sea. But many mutinies failed, ending with bodies thrown overboard and survivors left to rot in chains or worse. The consequences were brutal, a grim reminder that power was not given. It was taken, and held with a grip as merciless as the ocean's depths. Yet mutiny was sometimes the only choice left to men drowning in hopelessness. When a captain grew cruel or careless, when the ship was led into disaster after disaster, the crew's patience snapped. They seized their chance to rewrite their fate, even if it meant death for some and ruin for all. The threat of mutiny shaped every decision on a pirate ship, from how loot was divided to how punishments were meted out. Captains balanced cruelty with cunning, kindness with calculation, always watching, always wary. Because on a pirate ship, the deadliest enemy might be the man standing right beside you. Next, I will take you deeper into the darkness of mutiny's aftermath. The betrayals that left scars deeper than wounds, the fractured crews cast adrift, and the fragile new orders built on blood and fear. Listen closely, for the sea never forgets, and the echoes of betrayal haunt its waves forever. When mutiny shattered a ship's fragile order, the aftermath was as brutal as the rebellion itself. The victorious pirates didn't celebrate long. Their new reign was a precarious balance of fear, suspicion, and raw power. Every eye was a potential threat, every whisper a hidden dagger waiting to strike. The deck, once a place of brotherhood, became a court of suspicion where loyalty was tested and betrayal waited in the shadows. Those accused of siding with the old captain often met swift and terrible justice. Some were thrown overboard with weights tied to their ankles, swallowed by the relentless sea without a chance for farewell. Others were shackled below deck, left to rot in chains, their cries muffled by the constant creak of the ship. No trial, no mercy, only the cold, harsh judgment of the new order. The spoils of mutiny were never shared fairly. The new captain and his closest allies took the lion's share of any treasure or supplies, leaving the rest to fight over scraps. Greed grew in the hearts of men already starving and desperate, poisoning the fragile bonds that held the crew together. Soon, factions were formed, plotting new betrayals and power grabs, the cycle of violence never ending. Many mutinous ships were doomed to drift aimlessly, their crews fractured and directionless. Without a strong hand to guide them, storms or enemy ships often found these broken vessels easy prey. Pirates who survived mutiny frequently faced death not in battle, but in the loneliness of deserted islands, marooned with little hope of rescue. Yet in this chaos, some captains managed to forge new orders, rules harsher than before, enforced with iron fists and unyielding discipline. These leaders understood that fear was a weapon as potent as any sword. They crushed dissent quickly, made examples of traitors, and held the crew's loyalty through a mix of brutality and cunning. Such ships were feared not only by enemies but by other pirates who whispered tales of merciless captains who ruled like kings of the damned. Life under these rulers was no better than before. If anything, it was worse. Men lived in constant terror of punishment, their every move watched and judged. The dream of freedom that once drew them to piracy faded beneath layers of fear, pain, and unending struggle. The sea remained a graveyard of broken hopes and shattered lives. And so, the legend of pirates was forged, not in glory, but in blood, betrayal, and the relentless cruelty of survival. The ocean did not forgive. It did not forget. It swallowed all who dared defy it, leaving behind only whispers carried on the waves. Next, I will delve into the hidden horrors of pirate justice, the brutal punishments, secret executions, and the dark codes that governed life and death aboard these cursed ships. When you're ready, say the word. Captured pirates faced a nightmare that extended far beyond the ship's deck, into the grim prisons of port cities ruled by merciless empires. These dungeons were places where hope went to die, where darkness wasn't just the absence of light, but a living, suffocating presence that wrapped around the soul like chains. No pirate entered these prisons expecting mercy. The only question was how long they could endure before madness or death claimed them. The cells were tiny, barely large enough to lie down, with walls slick from centuries of damp and decay. Rats ran freely, gnawing on whatever scraps were left behind, and the air was thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and rot. Guards were cruel and indifferent, often tormenting prisoners for their own amusement or profit. Torture was routine, methods designed not just to inflict pain but to break wills. The rack stretched limbs beyond their limits, the thumbscrews crushed bones, and the Iron Maiden awaited those who refused to confess or betray their comrades. Food was scarce and vile, a thin gruel that barely sustained life, served infrequently and often crawling with insects. Water was rationed like gold, and dehydration was a slow killer. Disease thrived in these conditions. Fever, dysentery, and plague swept through cells like wildfire. Many prisoners died quietly in the dark, their bodies dragged away like refuse, their names forgotten by all but the sea. For those who survived, the waiting was unbearable. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, with no word of trial or release. The mind began to fracture under the weight of loneliness and despair. Some whispered to themselves, others screamed into the darkness, and some simply sat, eyes hollow, waiting for the inevitable. Yet, some pirates held on to defiance even in captivity. Secret codes were passed in whispers, promises made to escape or to take revenge. These flickers of rebellion kept the spirit alive, even when the body was broken. Occasionally, prisoners bribed guards or concocted daring escapes, though most attempts ended in brutal punishment or death. The prisons were the Empire's final weapon against piracy, a slow, grinding machine designed to crush the soul and extinguish the fire of rebellion. For many, death in a cell was the only escape from the endless cycle of violence, hunger, and betrayal that piracy demanded. Soon, I will take you back to the decks, to the desperate, brutal battles that decided who ruled the seas and who was left to drown beneath them. The roar of cannon fire tore through the morning fog like a beast unleashed, shaking the very air and drowning out every other sound except the screams of men and the crack of splintering wood. Battle was a terrifying symphony aboard pirate ships, guns blazing, cutlasses flashing, bodies thrown against rigging and railings as chaos ruled supreme. The sea churned red beneath the decks, a violent canvas stained with blood, sweat, and salt water. Pirates fought not for glory or honor, but for survival and greed, their faces twisted with desperation, eyes wild beneath sunburned brows. The smell of gunpowder and burning rope filled every breath, mingling with sweat and the metallic tang of blood. Every man knew his role. The gunners loaded and fired their cannons with grim efficiency. The sailors scrambled to reload muskets or ready pistols, and the fighters prepared for the deadly boarding that might come at any moment. Boarding was where true terror revealed itself. Ships collided with a deafening crash, and pirates surged forward like a tide of fury, screaming war cries and brandishing weapons sharpened not just on stones, but on the harsh reality of years at sea. The decks became a battlefield of slash and stab, a melee where strength, skill, and sheer brutality decided who lived and who died. There was no mercy, no quarter given. Wounded men were thrown overboard or finished off with a brutal blow. The cries of the dying were drowned out by shouts and the clash of steel, and even the strongest could fall in an instant, blood soaking the planks beneath their feet. In the frenzy, friend and foe were sometimes indistinguishable. The chaos swallowed faces and names alike. The victors claimed not just the ship but its treasures, chests filled with gold coins, barrels of rum, bolts of fine cloth, and the spoils of countless raids. The spoils were shared unevenly, favoring captains and officers, but even the lowliest pirate might find himself richer than he ever dreamed. Yet the taste of victory was bitter, haunted by the friends lost and the blood spilled, and shadowed by the certainty that the next battle might be their last. But battles were not always won. Many a pirate ship was sunk or captured, their crews scattered or enslaved. Those who survived faced long journeys in chains, their futures dark and uncertain. And even in victory, the scars of war ran deep, not just in bodies but in souls, carving lines of fear, rage, and sorrow that no rum could wash away. Soon, I will tell you about the code that bound pirates together amid the violence, the fragile laws they created to survive the madness and the cruelty they faced every day. Despite the chaos and cruelty, pirates lived by a code, a fragile set of rules known as the Articles that bound them together in a world ruled by violence and betrayal. These Articles were a grim contract, signed by every man before setting sail, outlining rights, duties, and punishments with a clarity born from bitter experience. The code was the only thing standing between order and anarchy aboard these floating hells. Among the Articles was the promise of fair shares. Loot was divided carefully, with captains, officers, and crew each receiving their agreed portions. This was one of the few things pirates guarded fiercely. No one could claim more than their due without risking mutiny or worse. Every man was entitled to a piece of the spoils, no matter how lowly his rank, a rare equality in a world otherwise ruled by harsh hierarchies. The code also dictated behavior: fighting on board without cause, theft from crewmates, and desertion were punishable by death or marooning. Discipline was strict but necessary. Without it, the ship would fall apart, and the fragile bonds holding the crew together would unravel. Each pirate knew the risks of breaking the articles, but survival often demanded desperate acts, blurring the lines between loyalty and self-interest. Pirates also agreed to care for their wounded and share resources in times of scarcity. When a man was injured, he was compensated with extra shares of loot, a grim form of insurance that acknowledged the dangers faced daily. This solidarity, however fragile, kept men fighting alongside each other even when hope seemed lost. Yet, the code was a double-edged sword. It enforced loyalty but also bred suspicion, as men watched each other for signs of cheating or betrayal. Every decision was weighed against the risk of mutiny. Captains ruled by fear and respect, their authority balanced precariously on the crew's willingness to follow. This code was not written on parchment but etched into the harsh reality of pirate life, tested in battles, storms, and betrayals. It was a desperate attempt to bring order to chaos, a beacon of law in a sea of lawlessness. Next, I will reveal the terrible diseases that plagued pirate crews, the invisible killers that took more lives than any cannon or sword ever could, and the desperate measures pirates took to survive their invisible enemies. Pirates faced enemies they could neither see nor fight with swords, the invisible killers lurking in the crowded, filthy conditions aboard ship. Disease was the quiet reaper stalking every corner of a pirate's life, claiming more lives than battles or hangings. It crept through the crew like a shadow, unstoppable and merciless, spreading with every breath, every shared cup, every unsanitary meal. Scurvy was the most infamous of these killers, a slow, agonizing death brought on by the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. Sailors' gums would swell and bleed, teeth loosened and fell out, and weakness drained their bodies until they could no longer stand. Limbs became swollen and painful, wounds refused to heal, and despair settled deep into the bones. Many pirates, too stubborn or too ignorant to change their diets, succumbed to this disease far from any hope of cure. Typhus and dysentery were just as deadly, fueled by cramped quarters and filthy conditions below deck. The stench of human waste, combined with the heat and humidity, created the perfect breeding ground for bacteria and lice that carried deadly fevers. Pirates would suffer relentless bouts of vomiting, diarrhea, and fever, their bodies racked by pain as they wasted away. Death often came quietly in the night, with comrades too sick or terrified to help. Other illnesses, like tuberculosis and smallpox, spread quickly in the tightly packed crew. Quarantine was impossible, and the sick were often left to suffer alone, their cries echoing through the dark hold. Infections from battle wounds grew into deadly gangrene without proper treatment, turning men into living corpses before their time. Doctors aboard pirate ships were scarce, often no more than men with rudimentary knowledge and crude tools. Their treatments included bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and superstitious rituals, none of which could stop the march of disease. Medicine chests held little more than rum, vinegar, and a few dried herbs, barely enough to soothe symptoms. As death claimed crewmates one by one, fear gripped the living. Men whispered about curses and punished those they suspected of bringing sickness aboard. Paranoia spread as fast as the illnesses, breeding distrust and further weakening the fragile unity needed to survive the endless hardships. Yet, despite all this, pirates continued their ruthless lives, driven by desperation, greed, or the faint hope of freedom. The sea claimed many, but those who lived bore scars, physical and mental, that never healed. Soon, I will tell you about the rare moments of celebration and respite, the brief lights in the darkness when pirates found laughter and drink amid the misery. Amid the endless hardships, the unbearable stench, the rotting food, and the ceaseless threat of death, pirates sometimes found brief moments to celebrate life, or at least forget its terrors. These were fleeting flashes of light in an ocean of darkness, brief respites where laughter and music fought back against despair. When the ship was safely anchored in a hidden cove or after a successful raid, the crew gathered around barrels of stolen rum, sharing what little warmth and joy they could scrape together. The bottles passed hand to hand, and with each gulp came a loosening of tongues and a dulling of pain. For a few precious hours, the weight of hunger, disease, and fear lifted, replaced by raucous songs, crude jokes, and stories taller than the tallest mast. But even these celebrations were tinged with desperation and danger. Rum was both a balm and a poison. Too much led to fights, accidents, and shattered alliances. Drunkenness could quickly turn from revelry to violence as old grudges resurfaced and tempers flared. The next day's hangovers were brutal, the pain in heads and bodies made worse by the knowledge that the next battle or storm could come at any moment. Games of chance filled the long, idle hours, two dice, cards, or the cruel knife games that sometimes ended in bloodshed. Gambling was more than entertainment. It was a gamble with fate itself, where men risked not just coins but lives and loyalties. A loss could mean exile, punishment, or death. A win might buy a fleeting sense of control in a world where control was nearly impossible. Despite the constant dangers, these moments of camaraderie forged bonds stronger than any chain. Men who faced death together could find solace in shared stories and songs, creating a fragile sense of family amid the chaos. They laughed at death, mocked their captains, and dreamed of freedom, even if such dreams were always just out of reach. But these lights were always dim and brief. The harsh reality of pirate life, the sickness, starvation, violence, and endless struggle, waited just beyond the next dawn. The ocean did not forgive, and the next wave could wash away even the brightest joys. Soon, I will take you into the terrifying storms that tested pirates' endurance, the relentless fury of nature that threatened to swallow ships whole and crush dreams beneath its waves. The ocean's fury was a force beyond any pirate's control, a relentless beast that tested the mettle of even the hardiest sailors. Storms could rise without warning, darkening the sky and turning calm seas into roiling chaos within minutes. Thunder cracked like cannon fire, lightning split the sky in jagged shards, and towering waves crashed against the ship with a violence that shook its very bones. During these tempests, the ship became a fragile prison tossed on an endless sea of fury. Pirates scrambled to secure sails and rigging, their muscles burning as they fought the wind and rain that blinded and battered them. The salt water stung their eyes and mouths, and the cold rain soaked through clothes to chill them to the bone. Every moment was a desperate battle against the storm's power, each crash of the waves threatening to tear the vessel apart or swallow it whole. Below deck, the chaos was no less terrifying. Men were thrown against walls and pinned beneath shifting cargo. Water flooded through cracks, soaking everything and turning the hold into a dark, freezing nightmare. Fear clawed at every heart as the ship groaned and creaked, threatening to break in two. The roar of the storm drowned out all else, leaving only the pounding of rain, the howling wind, and the desperate prayers of men clinging to survival. Many pirate ships were lost in storms, their crews dragged beneath the waves to drown in silence. Others limped into harbor battered and broken, their sails torn, their masts splintered, and their decks littered with the bodies of those who did not survive the fury of the sea. The storm was an indifferent executioner, offering no mercy, no warning, only destruction. For pirates, storms were a constant reminder that the sea was not a friend, but a cruel master demanding tribute in blood and sweat. No treasure, no victory, no dream of freedom could protect them from the wrath of the natural world that governed their lives. Yet, even in the face of such terror, pirates pressed on, driven by greed, desperation, or the faint hope that the next dawn might bring fortune or escape. The storm was just another obstacle in a life defined by hardship and peril. Soon, I will reveal the fate of those who survived storms, their scars, their stories, and the haunted lives they carried long after the waves had calmed. Surviving a storm was just the beginning of a new torment for pirates, The wounds, the loss, and the invisible scars that never healed. Bodies broken by the sea's violence ached relentlessly, muscles stiff and bones bruised. Every movement a reminder of that night when death danced just beneath the waves. Some men lost limbs or eyesight, forced to carry the burden of survival as a curse. Those who escaped with their lives often found themselves haunted by memories too vivid to forget. The screams of comrades lost, the crushing weight of water, the merciless roar of thunder drowning out their prayers. The ship itself bore the scars of the tempest, patched with rough planks and frayed ropes, its timbers creaking with every swell as if mourning the destruction it had endured. Crews worked tirelessly to repair sails torn to ribbons and hulls splintered by waves, knowing that any weakness could mean disaster the next time the sea turned against them. Each repair was a reminder of their vulnerability, the thin line between life and oblivion drawn sharp as a cutlass. Mental scars were deeper still. Sleep was haunted by nightmares of drowning, storms, and the faces of lost friends. Paranoia grew in the tight quarters, fears twisting into suspicion and anger. The constant threat of death bred a kind of madness that seeped into every conversation, every glance, every decision. Some men turned to alcohol to drown their fears, while others withdrew into silence, lost to the world even while standing among their crewmates. Despite everything, the pirate's life demanded relentless resilience. Every dawn was a new battle, against the sea, against enemies, against the cruelty of fate. The stories of survival became legends whispered in taverns, tales of men who cheated death and lived to fight another day, though forever changed. But survival was never guaranteed. The ocean was patient, and the price of defiance was high. Next, I will take you into the shadowy world of pirate alliances and betrayals, where friendships were fragile, and every partner could become an enemy in a heartbeat.